For 3 decades, millions of Americans ended their day the same way, sitting in front of their TVs, laughing, smiling, and trusting one man to make the world feel lighter. Johnny Carson wasn't just a talk show host, he was an institution, a symbol of charm, wit, and effortless cool, the kind of man you'd want to have a drink with, or maybe even be. But when the cameras stopped rolling and the audience's laughter faded into silence, that charm began to crack. Behind the scenes of The Tonight Show, there was another Johnny Carson, one haunted by demons that no one saw on screen. A man whose power could make or break careers, and whose temper could make even Hollywood's biggest stars afraid to cross him. The same man who made America laugh for 30 years was also fighting his own private wars, with fame, with addiction, and with himself. Tonight, we're peeling back the curtain on the darker world that existed behind the glittering desk, the feuds, the drinking, the paranoia, and the secrets that few dared to speak about until long after the camera stopped rolling. Because the real story of Johnny Carson's Tonight Show isn't just about laughter, it's about what happens when a man becomes untouchable and how that power can quietly destroy everything around him. The charm and the mask. Johnny Carson didn't just host The Tonight Show, he defined it. Night after night, he walked onto that stage with the kind of confidence that couldn't be faked. The suit was immaculate, the timing perfect, and the smirk, that knowing little grin, made audiences feel like they were in on a private joke with him. For millions of Americans, Carson wasn't just late-night entertainment. He was comfort, consistency, and class all rolled into one. He had a gift that few performers ever master, the ability to make everyone else feel like they were the star. Whether it was a nervous stand-up comic or a Hollywood legend promoting a new film, Carson knew exactly how to keep the spotlight warm but never blinding. When he gestured for a guest to come sit on the couch, it was like being knighted by the king of comedy himself. Careers were born in that small stretch of beige carpet between the guest chair and the sofa. But what the public didn't see was how deliberate that charm was. Carson wasn't just naturally funny, he was meticulously rehearsed. Every pause, every double take, every perfectly timed raise of the eyebrow had been fine-tuned after years of studying audiences. Off camera, he wasn't the same quick-talking charmer. In private settings, he was quiet, analytical, even withdrawn. Friends said he preferred small talk with a select few or silence altogether. For a man whose career depended on conversation, Johnny often seemed allergic to it. Producers and crew members described a kind of tension that filled the air the moment the on-air sign went dark. They never knew which version of Carson they were going to get, the charming ringmaster or the icy perfectionist. One moment he was cracking jokes and lighting up the room, the next he'd disappear into his dressing room without saying a word. He demanded perfection from everyone, but mostly from himself. That pressure, that relentless need for control, was both his greatest weapon and his most dangerous flaw. Yet none of this leaked out to the public. The image of Carson was bulletproof, built by decades of reputation, charm, and loyalty from an audience that adored him. In an era before social media and tabloid leaks, his public mask remained untouched. The man on television was all America ever saw, and that illusion worked so well that few ever stopped to ask what was hiding underneath it. But behind that mask, another Johnny was growing restless, one driven by habits and impulses that no camera could ever capture. And once that side took over, the consequences would ripple far beyond the walls of The Tonight Show. The alcohol shadow. Behind the perfect posture and the razor-sharp wit, Johnny Carson was a man quietly fighting a battle that no audience could see. Alcohol wasn't just a vice for him, it was a refuge. In the smoky bars of Los Angeles and New York, long after the studio lights had dimmed, Carson would drink not to celebrate success, but to escape from it, to drown out the noise of fame, the pressure to perform, and the loneliness that fame itself had built around him. Friends and colleagues said there were two Johnnies. The first was the charming entertainer, quick, funny, magnetic. The second appeared after a few drinks, darker, meaner, and unpredictable. It wasn't just his mood that changed, it was his entire demeanor. His voice would lower, his jokes would cut deeper, and the same confidence that made him America's favorite host turned into arrogance and anger. It was as if all the control he maintained so perfectly on stage simply vanished. Those who worked with him learned to tread carefully. Some crew members whispered that the worst nights were the ones when Carson showed up to rehearsal already buzzed, charming in public, volatile in private. There were outbursts, harsh words, even moments of silence so thick that the room seemed to freeze. Once during a taping delay, a staffer recalled him slamming a glass down so hard it shattered, followed by an eerie calm, as if nothing had happened. Nobody dared to mention it again. At home, the pattern was even more destructive. Carson's drinking bled into his personal life, poisoning his relationships and marriages one after another. His wives spoke of nights that began with laughter and ended in fear, of a man who could be tender one minute and furious the next. Joanne, his second wife, described him as two people living in the same body. When sober, he was gentle and kind. When drunk, she said, he was a stranger, unpredictable and cruel. Even after his 1982 arrest for driving under the influence, Carson never publicly addressed his drinking problem. He brushed it off with jokes on air, turning real pain into punchlines that his audience laughed at without realizing the truth behind them. "I don't drink anymore," he once quipped during a monologue, pausing just long enough for a grin. "Of course, I don't drink any less either." The crowd roared, never realizing that the line wasn't entirely a joke. Alcohol didn't just haunt Johnny Carson's nights, it haunted his legacy. It blurred the line between the man he wanted to be and the one he became. And as his drinking deepened, it began to erode the world he'd built so carefully, infecting not only his home life, but the very show that made him a legend. Because soon, even The Tonight Show couldn't hide the cracks that alcohol had started to carve beneath his flawless smile. The private hell. Johnny Carson was married 4 times, and each union started the same way, with laughter, admiration, and the irresistible pull of a man who could make anyone in the room feel special. But behind that golden smile was a restlessness he couldn't shake. He craved connection but couldn't sustain it. He wanted love but feared losing control of it. To the world, he was the ultimate gentleman. To the women who knew him best, he was a storm dressed in a tuxedo. His first marriage to Jody Morrow Walcott began before the fame, back when Carson was just a young radio host trying to make his mark. They had 3 sons together, but fame changed everything. Nights at home were replaced with endless rehearsals, parties, and a new kind of pressure that only success could bring. Friends recalled that as his career took off, Johnny began to drift emotionally and physically. The warmth that once defined him turned cold, and soon his marriage unraveled under the weight of jealousy, infidelity, and his growing dependence on alcohol. His second wife, Joanne Copeland, saw the duality even more clearly. To the public, she was the elegant partner of America's most beloved entertainer. Behind closed doors, she witnessed the darker Carson, the one who drank to silence his own thoughts. Joanne later said that Johnny was 2 men in one body. Sober Johnny was attentive, caring, brilliant. Drunk Johnny was unpredictable, distant, and sometimes cruel. The transformation was so sharp that friends described it as if a stranger had walked into the room. Eventually, even her patience broke, and the marriage dissolved amid accusations, loneliness, and emotional exhaustion. Then came Joanna Holland, Carson's 3rd wife, who entered his life at the peak of his fame. The cameras loved them, the powerful talk show host and the glamorous model. But the glamour didn't last. The same issues returned like ghosts: the drinking, the temper, the mistrust. When Joanna filed for divorce in 1983, it reportedly blindsided Carson, who was served the papers just hours before taping The Tonight Show. He performed the monologue that night as usual, never once letting the heartbreak show on his face. It was one of the clearest glimpses into his character. Even in pain, the mask never slipped. His final marriage to Alexis Mask came in 1987, long after the spotlight began to dim. By then, Carson seemed quieter, more withdrawn, and perhaps weary from the wars he'd fought with himself. The relationship lasted until his death, and though it appeared stable, it carried the marks of his past: emotional distance, guardedness, and a lingering sadness that never quite went away. Those close to him said Alexis brought him calm, but not redemption. By then, he was too practiced at keeping his emotions locked away. Each of Johnny Carson's marriages told the same story of a man searching for peace in all the wrong places. Fame gave him everything he ever wanted, yet it took from him the one thing he couldn't fake: intimacy. The audience adored him, the world worshipped him, but the people closest to him were often left nursing the wounds of loving a man who only knew how to perform affection, not live it. Power, influence, and the dark gatekeeping. In Hollywood, power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers from behind a desk at 11:30 p.m. Johnny Carson's Tonight Show wasn't just a talk show, it was a throne. To be invited on meant validation. To be invited back meant survival. For comedians, it was the ultimate stage, the place where a single laugh from Carson could launch a career. And just as easily, a cold stare from him could end one. Everyone wanted Johnny's approval, because in the entertainment world of the 1970s, he decided who got to shine. When a comic got the nod, that legendary invitation to sit on the couch after their set, it was an unspoken coronation. It meant Carson liked you, and the industry noticed. Jerry Seinfeld, Ellen DeGeneres, and David Letterman all passed through that rite of passage. But for every performer who basked in his approval, there were dozens who never got the chance, because Johnny didn't forget slights, and he rarely forgave them. If he thought you were arrogant, ungrateful, or disloyal, your phone simply stopped ringing. Those who worked closely with him said that Carson's power went far beyond the studio. He had connections in every network, and producers often checked his mood before making casting or guest booking decisions. His silence carried more weight than most executives' orders. Guests who interrupted him too much, challenged him, or made him look bad often found themselves quietly blacklisted. Some comedians later admitted that one awkward night on The Tonight Show could stall their careers for years. Few incidents illustrate this better than his feud with Wayne Newton. Newton accused Carson of making offhand jokes about his masculinity on air. When Newton confronted him privately, Carson reportedly smirked and dismissed it. The exchange turned bitter. Newton later described Carson as mean-spirited and vindictive, claiming the host tried to humiliate him publicly. In an era when reputations were currency, Carson's opinion could ruin you without a word. Newton wasn't the only one who felt the sting. Countless rising stars learned that offending Johnny, even unintentionally, was a mistake you only made once. And it wasn't just the guests who feared him. Writers, producers, and even band members knew the hierarchy by heart. Carson was kind and generous when he wanted to be, but he also demanded absolute loyalty. When tempers flared, he could go weeks without speaking directly to his staff, issuing notes through intermediaries instead. Former writers described walking into the studio each morning wondering which Johnny they'd get, the warm mentor or the silent tyrant. Everyone knew that their jobs, their reputations, and sometimes their sanity depended on staying in his good graces. Johnny Carson had mastered a different kind of performance, one not for the cameras, but for control. His smile could make someone's dreams come true, and his silence could destroy them. To the public, he was still the man who made America laugh. To those in his orbit, he was also the man who reminded them that power in Hollywood didn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wore a grin. Moments of explosive behavior. For a man who built his reputation on composure, Johnny Carson had moments where that cool exterior shattered in seconds. The audience saw a man in control of every quip, every pause, every eyebrow lift, but behind the scenes there were flashes of anger that left even seasoned crew members speechless. His temper was legendary in private circles, a fuse that could burn silently for days before erupting without warning. And when it did, no one wanted to be in the blast zone. One of the most infamous outbursts happened during a taping delay in the mid-1970s. Don Rickles, guest hosting The Tonight Show for a few nights, accidentally broke Carson's prized cigarette box, a sleek silver case that sat permanently on Johnny's desk. When Carson discovered the damage, he didn't laugh it off. He marched across the NBC lot to the studio where Rickles was filming his sitcom CPO. Sharkey barged in during the middle of a scene and confronted him in front of the entire cast and crew. Cameras were rolling, and the moment later became TV lore. The crowd laughed, but insiders said Carson wasn't joking. He was genuinely furious, and the laughter only disguised how personal it felt. Other eruptions weren't televised. A producer once recalled that Carson, frustrated over a missed cue, hurled a cue card across the studio and stormed off set without a word. Another night, during a writer's meeting, he allegedly slammed his fist on the desk so hard that pens scattered onto the floor. He didn't shout. He just stood up, adjusted his tie, and walked out, leaving a silence that nobody dared to break. Moments like that became part of the studio legend, the invisible line you never wanted to cross. Even his closest colleagues weren't immune. Longtime sidekick Ed McMahon knew how to read the warning signs, the tightening jaw, the sudden quiet. On camera, their chemistry seemed effortless. Off camera, there were nights when the tension between them could chill the room. Crew members remembered McMahon tiptoeing around him after shows, always diffusing tension with humor. But there were times when even Ed couldn't smooth things over. And Carson's mood would darken for days, casting a shadow over the entire staff. Those who tried to confront him learned quickly that Johnny didn't handle criticism well. If someone challenged him, he'd retreat behind icy sarcasm or simply cut them off. More than one writer was quietly reassigned after clashing with him, and a few never worked on the show again. His temper wasn't explosive in the way of yelling or throwing tantrums. It was colder than that, quieter, more surgical. He knew how to make you feel the sting without ever raising his voice. And yet, every night, he'd walk back onto that stage with that same effortless charm, the grin, the glide, the perfect timing. The public never saw the tension, never sensed the damage. To them, Carson was still the man who could make America forget its worries. But behind the curtain, his own worries were beginning to consume him. The cracks were getting harder to hide, and those closest to him knew that eventually, even Johnny Carson couldn't keep both versions of himself under control. Erased history and the disappearing act. By the end of his career, Johnny Carson had done something almost impossible in Hollywood. He vanished. No scandals, no farewell tour, no tell-all memoir. One night, he simply said goodnight to America, walked off the Tonight Show stage for the last time in 1992, and never came back. It was the kind of exit that legends dream about, graceful, complete, and final. But to those who knew him, it felt less like closure and more like disappearance, as if Johnny wasn't just leaving the stage, but erasing himself from it. Even before his retirement, there were signs that Carson's relationship with his own legacy was complicated. NBC had erased thousands of early Tonight Show tapes from the 1960s, a decision made partly to save storage space, but also, some said, with Johnny's quiet approval. Those shows were history, a living archive of American television, and yet Carson seemed strangely indifferent to their destruction. To him, the past was something to be perfected in memory, not preserved in reality. Once the camera stopped, he wanted it gone. It fit a pattern that had always defined him. Carson controlled everything, the lighting, the timing, the laughter, even his own myth. When something didn't meet his standards, he preferred to destroy it rather than let it linger as an imperfection. Friends said that same instinct carried into his personal life, cutting people off, burning bridges, starting fresh as if history could simply be rewritten. To Johnny, control wasn't just a preference, it was a form of survival. After retirement, he retreated into a kind of silence that felt almost ghostly. He stopped giving interviews, rarely appeared in public, and refused nearly every request to return to television. Even the press couldn't find him. One journalist described him as a man who spent 30 years talking to America, only to spend the rest of his life refusing to say another word. When he did write, it was in short notes to friends, dry, witty, but distant, like someone still performing from behind a curtain. Rumors began to swirl that he was lonely, regretful, or quietly battling health issues. Some claimed he spent his final years sailing, surrounded by the ocean and silence he'd always loved. Others said he was simply tired of the machine he had built, ready to let it consume itself without him. Whatever the truth, his withdrawal felt deliberate, almost poetic. The man who once controlled America's laughter now controlled his own vanishing. And when Carson finally passed away in 2005, it was the perfect final act, quiet, private, and completely under his control. No spectacle, no farewell show, no confession, just a legend fading back into the same silence from which he'd once emerged. For a man who spent his life mastering the illusion of intimacy, disappearing completely was perhaps the only honest thing he ever did. Legacy versus hidden reality. Johnny Carson's legacy was built on laughter. To millions, he was the voice that ended their day with a smile, the man who seemed effortlessly perfect. But every legend has a shadow, and Carson's was longer than most. The same qualities that made him a genius on stage, control, timing, and restraint, were the very things that imprisoned him in private. His success was spotless, but his soul wasn't. Behind the glitz of The Tonight Show, he was a man who wrestled with isolation, anger, and regret. It's easy to remember the polished performer, the quick wit, the gentle smirk that could turn any awkward silence into gold. But the truth is that Johnny's charm was armor, a shield forged from discipline and fear. He couldn't afford to be vulnerable, not even with the people closest to him. His power, his fame, even his humor, all of it was a form of control. On screen, he dictated every beat. Off screen, he couldn't control anything at all. For decades, America saw only the myth. They didn't see the man who sat alone in his Malibu home long after the applause had faded, replaying old tapes not out of nostalgia, but to analyze himself, to dissect every hesitation, every misplaced word. Friends said Carson's greatest critic was always himself. That perfectionism, which made him untouchable in television, also made him unreachable as a person. He could make an audience laugh in seconds, but couldn't tell his own son that he loved him. The real tragedy of Johnny Carson wasn't that he had demons, it's that he faced them in complete solitude. He didn't ask for help, didn't show weakness, didn't let anyone close enough to see the cracks. For all his power, he lived and died as one of the loneliest men in Hollywood. The laughter that filled every living room in America was the same sound that echoed through his empty house at night, a reminder of the connection he could give others but never keep for himself. Even today, his legend remains divided. Ask one person, and they'll describe him as the greatest television host who ever lived. Ask another, and they'll recall a man who left behind a trail of broken relationships and unspoken apologies. Both are true. Johnny Carson was both the best and worst parts of the American dream, proof that success can buy everything except peace. In the end, Carson's legacy is a paradox, a man who made the world laugh but couldn't make himself happy. His story forces us to ask whether greatness is ever worth the cost of humanity, because behind every perfect performance lies a truth no camera can capture. Sometimes, the people who bring us the most joy are the ones carrying the deepest pain. The curtain falls. When Johnny Carson said his final goodnight in 1992, it sounded like closure, the perfect ending to a perfect career. But looking back, it feels more like a confession. Those simple words, "I bid you a very heartfelt goodnight," carried the weight of 30 years of laughter, control, and hidden pain. The audience thought they were saying goodbye to a host. In truth, they were witnessing a man finally releasing a mask he'd worn for decades. Carson's story isn't just about fame, it's about the illusion of it. He built an empire on authenticity, yet lived most of his life behind walls. He could charm a nation, but struggled to keep a single friendship intact. Every night, he gave people laughter, but he rarely gave anyone himself. The applause that followed him home each night wasn't comfort, it was noise that reminded him he'd have to do it all again tomorrow. Behind the success, behind the sharp suits and effortless jokes, was a man terrified of imperfection. He spent his life editing his show, his relationships, his own image, until nothing messy or human was left. Maybe that's why he let those early tapes of The Tonight Show be destroyed. Maybe deep down, Johnny Carson didn't want anyone to see the real him, unfiltered, flawed, and afraid. He wanted the myth to live on, because myths can't disappoint you the way people can. But even in his silence, Carson left lessons. He showed us that perfection isn't peace, that laughter can hide loneliness, and that even legends have limits. His darkness doesn't erase his brilliance, it explains it. The same pain that isolated him also fueled the timing, the edge, the genius that no host since has ever fully replicated. His flaws don't diminish his greatness, they define it. And maybe that's the real legacy of Johnny Carson. Not the fame, not the fortune, not the hundreds of millions who tuned in to watch him night after night. It's the reminder that every smile has a story and every icon is still human. That even the man who made the world laugh was in the end just another soul trying to find light in the dark. So the next time you see that old black and white clip, Johnny behind the desk, chin resting on his hand, that knowing smile playing at the corner of his lips, look a little closer. Behind the laughter, behind the legend, you might just glimpse the truth he spent a lifetime hiding. And maybe that's the part of Johnny Carson that deserves to be remembered most. In the end, Johnny Carson's greatest act wasn't on The Tonight Show, it was his ability to disappear behind the smile. He taught the world to laugh even while carrying his own pain in silence. Maybe that's why people still can't let him go. Because Johnny's story isn't just about fame or downfall, it's about the cost of perfection, about how easy it is to lose yourself in the version the world wants to see. Behind every joke, there's a truth. Behind every legend, a human being. And behind Johnny Carson's laughter, there was always a quiet cry for something real.